Hi again and welcome back to this series of videos, our beginner's guide to music direction in musical theatre. This is the YouTube channel for those involved in the direction of music in musical theatre, or for those interested to help you lead, encourage and inspire all performers working in front of you. So far, we've looked at your role as the music director, knowing what's expected of you. We've looked at choosing productions, some basic conducting technique, the audition process, music rehearsals and leading those music and singing rehearsals, and working with your production colleagues. We've moved into the theatre, we've had our technical and our dress rehearsal and our performance. Take a look back if you haven't seen any of those videos yet. But now we're going to take a step backwards. In this video, we're going to take a more detailed look at selecting your band or orchestra. How do you choose which instruments to use when you're on a budget? Please do subscribe by hitting the button below so you can be informed when further videos are released and have access, easy access, to all the other videos in the series. Ask me any questions in the comments box. If there's anything specific you want me to cover, let me know. Okay, let's make a start then by selecting a band or orchestra. Time and time again, I'm asked by students, how do I go about choosing which instruments to use and which instruments to leave out when working on a budget? The musical is orchestrated for, say, 24 musicians, but the group can only afford half of that. How do I go about making those decisions? Now, it's important to point out, if you're working on a professional production, you may be asked to reorchestrate the entire score to fit the musicians contracted by the producer. But don't be tempted to make any changes to the orchestration supplied by your rights holder. Professional productions may be given permission to rewrite. In amateur theatre, that's virtually always not allowed. Now, it's unfortunate but oh so very true that it really all comes down to money. If your group can afford the full orchestration, then we don't have a problem. However, when we need to make cuts to the number of players, which instruments we decide to use needs some very careful consideration. When working on the budget and you need to make these decisions, orchestrations normally fall into 4 specific areas. Now, these areas are not specifically orchestral sections of a traditional orchestra, as you would expect, but each of these areas add what I would call an additional level of complexity or colour within any orchestration. The rhythm or drums and bass, the guitar and or piano, brass and woodwind, and strings and or, dare I say it, keyboards. So let's take a look at each of these sections in turn. The drums and bass are clearly both necessary elements within any musical accompaniment, unless of course you're just using a piano. Whether it's a double bass or a bass guitar would almost always depend on the musical itself. A bass guitar would be preferable for a rock musical, for instance, and maybe not for the Marriage of Figaro. But when it comes to drummers, I have in the past come across the question as to whether or not I would employ a drummer that is a non-music reader. Many directors wouldn't. Maybe this question needs a little more explanation. One would automatically think that if a musical is being orchestrated and a music part for a drummer has been supplied, one should use a drummer that would be able to read that part. Some years back, I played in a band for a production of Jesus Christ Superstar, and the music director asked me if he felt he had made a mistake by employing a drummer that we both knew at the time who couldn't read music. Given that Jesus Christ Superstar has a considerable amount of rock music involved, and given we both knew the capabilities of the drummer in question, it was decided to go ahead and book this particular non-reading musician. He made a terrific member of the band. And because he couldn't read, I believe made an extra effort to ensure that what was required of a drummer in this musical was met. and he certainly did that. Depending on certain musical productions, don't automatically dismiss any drummer that doesn't read music. I have a feeling some people may disagree with that. While we're talking about rhythm, it's worth noting that should there be an additional percussion part available for any particular musical, although it may be a luxury from an economical point of view, it is so very much worth it. It may invariably include timpani, xylophone, glockenspiel, congas and numerous other instruments to hit, shake and rattle that give an additional level of musical enhancement. Instruments like the piano and guitar both add the harmonic element to our accompaniment. If you're working on a budget and need to reduce the orchestration, if there is a guitar part available, I would be very tempted to include it because of that harmonic element the instrument would bring. And not least, if you're using it in a rock musical, it would be folly not to include the guitar and guitars. Your pianist that may have been with you throughout the entire rehearsal process may want to be included when it comes to being part of the band. And why wouldn't they? If the band or orchestra has been reduced because of economics, however, you're going to need to rely on any pianist or keyboard player to fill in the blanks. That, of course, will be apparent with the reduced number of musicians. I would like to think that the experienced pianists among us and keyboard players would not just play the vocal score that they have been playing at rehearsals until this point. Listening to a melody being sung and doubled on the piano, or doubling the bass, which some bassists hate by the way, throughout the entire performance can soon become somewhat tedious for any listener, musically qualified or not. So we now have what could be seen as the vital elements within any orchestration. We have our rhythmic, bass and harmonic elements for our accompaniment. We now have what's sometimes referred to as a combo. This combo would be the minimum you would use for any full-scale musical production. If you're putting on some form of variety show or review, then this is a good solution. And if your pianist or keyboard player has access to more keyboard patches or sounds, even better. So if we are working on a budget, any additional musicians from this point onwards is an added bonus, one could say. Depending on the particular musical, brass instruments add a level of what I like to call brilliance and substance, and of course power to any orchestration. Particularly with musicals that require that big brass sound, these musicians are going to be key. When using any brass instruments and you need to cut down on the number of players, I like to use a minimum of 2 trumpets and 1 trombone. Why is that combination? Well, 2 trumpets and a trombone will invariably form a triad. You therefore now have harmonic content in the brass. No individual brass player is going to sound out of place if they are forming part of a harmonic section in themselves. Don't be tempted only to use 1 trumpet if your musical is arranged for 2 or 3. I've witnessed it before, and unless the production is orchestrated that way, for 1 trumpet I mean, it will sound very obtrusive and the overall sound will be thin and empty. Horn players, and with that I mean French horn players, add a level of depth and warmth to any orchestration and use a lot for counter melody. And if the orchestration calls for a second horn, this can really make the difference, but I know we're under budget and that might prevent this. Just before we leave the subject of brass players, it's worth noting that in some musicals they require some heavy use of such players. I'm thinking of musicals along the lines of Copacabana or 42nd Street and the like. And these will require some proficient players, especially trumpet 1. Moving on to the woodwind section now. Many modern orchestrations can use up to 5 different woodwind players. If budgets are an issue, it's usually the case, not always, but usually the case that reed parts 1, 2 and 3 should be used in that order. Like I say, there are some exceptions to this rule. Please be mindful, however, that should you request that certain musicians change books for certain musical numbers within your production, and I mean swapping from read 2 to 3 for instance, please try to keep this to a minimum and certainly avoid players having to change books mid-number. It's just not fair for reed players. Of course, woodwind instruments not only add harmony to the orchestration, but are excellent at providing further counter melody and what I like to describe as added sparkle and serenity to any orchestration. More often than not, woodwind players in pit orchestras are usually required to double. In other words, play more than one instrument. We haven't quite reached the level where they're able to play both instruments at the same time yet, or have we? Remember too that this doubling is another level of complexity if you're expecting players to keep changing books. It's also worth noting that more traditional orchestrations, such as those in Gilbert and Sullivan opera and perhaps in some Rodgers and Hammerstein's musicals, would require only one player per instrument. Now let's talk about string sections. This is without doubt the most difficult area if you are on a tight budget, and will start to pose the question as to whether or not one should use traditional string players or keyboard players playing string patches. I talk much more about this in detail in another video, so if you're making those kind of decisions at the moment, I'll put a link in the description below. Look out for that video, it might be a bit controversial. Dare I say it, but a true string sound is only produced by proficient players. Regardless of the size of the string section, if you have one player whose tuning, for instance, may not be at the same standard as the others, this will really stand out. When it comes to the minimum number of players, given that a lot will depend on the musical itself, a small string section, I feel, would be 2 first violins, 2 second violins, a viola and a cello. 6 players. Now, I've known music directors employ fewer than 6 players to make up a string section, and this can work. However, if it is then mixed with 2 or even 3 woodwind players and 2 or 3 brass players, the much reduced string section does sound exceedingly thin and therefore somewhat unbalanced. So then 6 players for the strings has increased our costs quite significantly. As I mentioned just then, in another video, and I'll put a link below in the comments, we'll be looking at the advantages and disadvantages of using string players versus keyboard players using string patches or sounds. So that brings us to the end of part 7 in this series. In the next video, now that we've made our decisions on what instrumentation we're going to use, we're going to be looking at the band call. Sometimes the only rehearsal the band will have with you as music director, dedicated just for the musicians. We'll look at what needs to be arranged in advance and what you need to prepare for. We'll also be looking at working with the band and running the band call itself. Click on the subscribe button below and let me know your thoughts in the comments section. I hope you'll join me then.